The crack of splintering wood echoed across Willowgate Lake as the wedding dock began its slow drift into open water, taking 200 panicked guests with it. The bride screamed, Karen Delacroix shrieked about lawsuits, and I, watching from my porch with a fresh lemonade and my binoculars, couldn't help but mutter, "This is just the beginning." My name is Hank Rayner, and 30 minutes earlier, I'd warned Karen that my dock wasn't a free venue. Now, watching the chaos unfold from the safety of my property, I felt that familiar satisfaction that comes from being absolutely right at exactly the right moment. That Saturday had started like any peaceful weekend on the lake. I'd stepped outside with my morning coffee, ready to feed the ducks and maybe oil a few boards on the dock. The water was still, fog curled at the edges of the trees, and the only sounds were chirping birds and the distant hum of a boat engine. Then came the unmistakable shriek of a power drill. I turned and nearly dropped my mug. A massive white canopy was halfway up on my dock. Beneath it, several folks in pastel dresses were setting up wedding chairs. Two burly guys were hauling in a portable speaker system, and right in the middle of it all was Karen. Karen Delacroix was the kind of woman who gave suburban moms a bad name. As HOA president, she believed she ruled this community like a monarch with a clipboard. Her hair was aggressively highlighted, her sunglasses cost more than my pickup, and her favorite sentence was always prefaced with, "as per HOA policy." I dodged her calls, her newsletters, and her surprise property visits for months, but now she'd finally crossed the line. My dock, my property, was being transformed into a full-blown wedding venue, complete with flower arrangements and champagne buckets. I stormed down the path to the water, stepping around folding chairs and floral arches. Karen spotted me just as I stepped onto the dock. "Oh, Hank," she chirped. "Don't worry. We'll clean everything up afterward. We're just using it for a few hours. It's for my niece's special day." I stopped cold. "Karen, this is not community space. This is private property. You don't have permission. Take all this down right now." She waved a piece of paper at me like it held magical authority. "I already cleared it with the HOA. Look." She handed me a flyer. It was a wedding invitation. Not a permit, not even close. "This isn't a legal document," I said. "You can't host an event on someone else's property without permission. That's trespassing." Karen's smile soured, but only for a second. "Hank, don't be difficult. This affects the whole neighborhood. It's not just about you. Think of how romantic this is. The lake, the view, the pictures. My niece will cherish this forever." I folded the paper in half and handed it back. "No, get off my dock." She turned away before I finished speaking, barking orders at the catering crew and gesturing to the DJ setting up near my fishing chair. They ignored me completely. I stood there, stunned, as the dock swelled with guests arriving early, selfie sticks flashing, heels clicking against the wood. Karen had crossed the line so far she couldn't even see it anymore. I walked back up to the house calmly, not saying a word. I had warned Karen once, and that was all I owed her. The thing she didn't know, and what I didn't bother reminding her, was that my dock was detachable. I'd been doing repairs on the piling system over the winter and had designed a temporary quick-release mechanism so I could replace support beams without hauling in a barge. It took me 10 minutes in the boathouse to flip the release lever. Back on my porch, I sat in my rocking chair and raised my binoculars. The ceremony had just begun. The groom stood at the front with trembling hands, the bridesmaids giggled nervously, and Karen stood off to the side near the generator, checking her phone. Then the dock let out a long, low groan as it detached and drifted backward. It started slowly, so no one noticed right away. But when the flower girl stumbled and pointed at the water now visible between the dock and shore, the panic set in. Guests screamed. Someone shouted for a rope. The DJ's table tipped, and a speaker fell into the lake with a splash. The bride dropped her bouquet and grabbed her veil as it blew sideways. The groom tried to act like it was part of the plan, but even he looked like he was about to hurl. Karen screamed something about a lawsuit. A toddler dove for a balloon and nearly slid under a table. All the while, the dock floated steadily, confidently, into the middle of the lake. My phone buzzed with a call. It was Tom from the sheriff's department. "Hank, tell me I'm not watching your dock with a wedding on it drifting across the lake right now." "You're watching it. Did you detach it?" I took a sip of lemonade. I didn't touch anything. I just warned Karen. The doc must have had other plans. He laughed so hard he hung up. Down at the lake, Karen grabbed a megaphone from the catering team and started shouting directions. Her voice cracked as she demanded calm. Nobody listened. A paddleboat launched from one neighbor's yard, driven by 2 HOA volunteers. They looked like 2 squirrels paddling a log in a hurricane. One slipped and fell in, the other screamed and kept spinning in circles. The bride's mother fainted and landed face first into a platter of shrimp cocktail. It was beautiful. It was chaos. And it was all on live stream. Unbeknownst to Karen, one of the teenagers filming had started a live broadcast. Within minutes, comments were pouring in. Lake wedding turns into Titanic sequel. Karen's Dock of Doom. Is this a horror movie or a rom-com? People were screen recording, reposting, and laughing from across the globe. I set my binoculars down and leaned back in my chair. The sun was high now, casting shimmering ripples across the lake. The birds had returned to chirping. The chaos was still unfolding on the water, but for me, peace had returned. At least for now, because I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't take humiliation lightly, and something told me she'd be back, with paperwork, with drama, with fire in her eyes. But I had plans for that too. The dock was nearly 50 yards out when chaos hit its peak. The music had cut out entirely, and the soft sound of lake water slapping against wood planks was now louder than the DJ's busted speaker. Guests scrambled, some trying to call for help, others just shouting into the wind as if sheer volume could reverse their floating fate. I watched it all unfold from my porch like I was sitting front row at a slapstick comedy show. My binoculars fogged up from the steam of my coffee, and I had to wipe them down twice to get a clear look at Karen, who was standing center dock, flailing her arms like a traffic controller at a burning airport. Karen finally seemed to realize the severity of what was happening. She whipped out her phone and began pacing in circles, probably calling the HOA board or maybe trying to reach a tugboat. But even in the chaos, she kept pausing to flash an overly dramatic look at her surroundings, as though she were starring in a reality show titled Disaster Bride. Meanwhile, the bride had taken off her heels and was now sobbing into a handful of soggy tissues while the groom stood silently, clutching the edge of the dock with both hands like it would somehow stop the drifting. Then came the paddleboat rescue attempts. 2 of them. One launched from the Hendersons' yard, and the other from what I assumed was one of Karen's more loyal lackeys. Each had 2 people paddling furiously in circles, clearly not trained for any kind of water rescue. The first paddleboat got halfway there before someone in a full suit leaned too far over, tipping it on its side and sending them both into the lake with a splash. Screams echoed again, followed by a short cheer from someone still on the dock who clearly didn't like the guy who fell in. The second boat, paddled by 2 people like kids on a sugar high, managed to reach the edge of the dock but had no way to tie it down. They'd forgotten rope. Instead, they latched onto the dock by holding the edges with their bare hands. As the current pulled the dock further out, the paddleboat began spinning like a cheap carnival ride. One of the women aboard finally gave up and let go, drifting aimlessly while yelling that she was getting seasick. I had to cover my mouth to stifle a laugh. Then the real twist hit. A news helicopter arrived. At first, just the soft chop of rotors in the distance, then it hovered in louder, circling the scene like a vulture over roadkill. Karen noticed it immediately and went into full PR mode. She straightened her blouse, pulled her sunglasses down from her head, and grabbed a microphone from the DJ's ruined station. Through the broken speakers, her voice boomed weakly, full of artificial cheer. "Thank you for joining us today for our beautiful floating lake ceremony. We are thrilled to bring such a unique celebration to Lake Meredith. Please enjoy the open bar and floating hors d'oeuvres." I nearly dropped my coffee mug from how hard I laughed. A floating lake ceremony? She was actually trying to spin this into a planned event. Never mind that people were clutching overturned tables, that a small child was trying to fish a Barbie shoe out of the water with a plastic fork, or that half the guests looked like they wanted to jump and swim for shore. The news chopper hovered lower. Someone must have tipped them off with the live stream link. Moments later, a reporter's voice echoed across the water through a loudspeaker from the chopper. "We are live over Lake Meredith, where a wedding celebration appears to be adrift. No official word yet on whether this was planned or a mishap." Karen doubled down on her act, smiling and waving like a pageant queen. The bride, now sitting cross-legged in a damp white dress, looked like she was about to scream. The groom, to his credit, kept a hand on her shoulder, either to comfort her or make sure she didn't jump. Back on shore, a few neighbors began to gather on their own docks, watching the spectacle with binoculars, lawn chairs, and even a few beers. I spotted Jim from 3 houses down recording with his old camcorder. He waved when he saw me looking. I gave him a nod. We both knew this would be the talk of the lake for years. Eventually, a rescue boat from the marina started making its way over, slowly, with a sheriff's deputy on board. They weren't rushing. Maybe they, too, understood that no one was in real danger, and this comedy of errors needed time to play out. When the boat finally reached the dock, Karen immediately ran up to the officer and began what I could only assume was an over-the-top recounting of the event. The officer didn't even write anything down. He just listened, nodded, then gestured toward the shore. The guests were escorted back in waves, one group at a time, while the dock was towed in the opposite direction toward the marina for inspection. Karen remained the last on board, standing at the edge, arms folded, seething. She looked across the lake right at me. I raised my mug in a mock toast. Her expression tightened like she'd just bitten into a lemon. Later that evening, the neighborhood group chat exploded. The video was everywhere. Clips were being shared on every platform. Comments rolled in non-stop. People were calling it the wedding that set sail. One user dubbed it Titanic 2. Another said it looked like an avant-garde theater piece sponsored by Chaos. Someone even added music over the footage, setting Karen's megaphone speech to circus music. By sunset, I received a message from my old army buddy, now a county official, asking if I needed legal backup. I told him I hadn't touched a thing. The dock simply went where it wanted. He replied with 3 words, "You magnificent bastard." Still, I knew it wasn't over. Karen would regroup. She would march into some office demanding consequences, retribution, and revenge. But I wasn't worried, because what she didn't know yet was that everything she'd done had been caught on my security cameras. Her orders to staff, her dismissal of my warnings, her marching onto private property with a clipboard and no permission. I had it all, and I had plans for round 2. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled less than 24 hours after the floating wedding fiasco. It wasn't technically an emergency meeting, but Karen labeled it one anyway. She'd sent out a message through the community app late the previous night, filled with capital letters, passive aggression, and her signature threat that consequences will follow. The meeting took place in the rec center just up the hill from the lake, the same place where they usually hosted bingo nights and book club discussions. But tonight, the atmosphere buzzed like a hornet's nest someone had kicked. Everyone showed up. Not just the board members, not just the HOA regulars. This time, even the folks who usually stayed quiet made an appearance, curiosity written all over their faces. Karen strutted into the room like she was walking into a courtroom she owned. Her blouse was perfectly pressed, her pearls extra shiny, and her expression was a cross between fake calm and bottled rage. She stood behind the podium and adjusted the mic like a politician about to make a public plea for sympathy. "Thank you for coming," she said, scanning the crowd. "As many of you know, an unfortunate incident occurred yesterday involving a private dock and a community celebration. Unfortunate was an understatement, and calling it a community celebration was a lie." A few folks in the audience exchanged glances. A couple even chuckled. Karen continued, trying to sound composed. "We believe that the dock in question was manipulated in a way that endangered the safety of our guests and residents. There was no permit pulled, no safety inspection, and frankly, no warning." That last part was too much. I cleared my throat and raised my hand. Karen ignored it. I raised it higher and spoke without waiting. "Actually, I gave you a very clear warning. I told you the dock was private, and I told you it wasn't secured. You brushed it off." Several people nodded, remembering the video that had gone viral just hours after the incident. It had made the rounds like wildfire. Everyone had seen the dock drift. Everyone had seen Karen standing front and center, pretending the chaos was all part of the plan. Karen tried to keep control of the room. That video was edited and taken out of context. The full story is more complicated. "The people who were there know exactly what happened," I replied. "And they also know you never asked for permission. You trespassed. You hosted an event you didn't have authority to hold, and now you're trying to play the victim." A woman in the front row spoke up. "I was there. I nearly fell into the lake trying to save my purse. You never even asked us if it was safe." Another man said, "My wife got sick from the food after it sat in the sun all day." Karen's eyes darted around as more residents started speaking one after the other. The tide was turning, and she could feel it. One of the board members, a retired firefighter named Paul, stood up. He'd always been fair, quiet, and didn't get involved unless there was a real issue. "Karen," he said, "you've overstepped before, but this was beyond that. You endangered people, and worse, you tried to use your title to justify it. This isn't the first time you've acted like our private property is your playground." Karen's face flushed. Her hands gripped the podium. "You're all missing the bigger picture. I was trying to create a beautiful event, something we could all be proud of. This community needs unity." "What this community needs," Paul cut in, "is leadership that respects boundaries, and you clearly don't." The meeting spiraled from there. People brought up old grievances, times Karen had entered yards without notice, fines she'd issued for arbitrary rule violations, her habit of approving her own projects with no vote. By the end of the night, a motion had been made and seconded to vote on her removal as HOA president. Karen objected, of course, claimed the bylaws didn't allow such short notice. But the board decided to follow procedure and called for a vote the following week. Everyone left the room buzzing. Karen left first, practically sprinting to her car, sunglasses on even though it was well past dark. The next morning, I paid a visit to my lawyer. His office was across town in a converted farmhouse with more books than furniture. I slid a flash drive across his desk. "Everything's on there. Video, audio, timestamps." He plugged it in and clicked through the folders. I'd captured everything from the morning of the wedding, Karen directing the setup, ignoring my warnings, scoffing when I said the dock wasn't safe. I even had audio of her bragging about how the HOA always backs her no matter what. My lawyer leaned back and nodded slowly. "We can file a cease and desist for trespassing, and you've got enough here for a small claims suit. Want to go that route?" I thought for a second. "Let's send the cease and desist first. Let her stew. Then we decide how deep we want to cut." He grinned. "Got it." A few hours later, Karen received a letter via courier, complete with legal letterhead and a clear warning that any future unauthorized use of my property would be met with full legal action. She didn't respond that day, but I saw her from across the street, staring at me with a look that could peel paint. I gave her a little wave and went back to trimming my hedges. 2 days later, she showed up on my doorstep with a tray of cupcakes. Not just any cupcakes, fancy, overpriced, too-sweet bakery ones in a box with a bow. I didn't even open the door. I watched her through the glass. She rang the bell again, forced a smile, and said she just wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding. I opened the door enough to talk, but not enough for her to see the security camera recording everything. "Apology accepted," I said. "But just so we're clear, you step on my dock again without permission, I'll have you charged with trespassing. And this time, I won't wait for the HOA board to catch up." Her smile twitched. I could see the fire behind her eyes. She didn't like being told no. Didn't like losing. She placed the cupcake box on the porch and turned to leave, heels clicking on the path like gunshots. I waited until she was gone before I opened the box and tossed it straight into the trash. I knew it wasn't the end. Karen never lost quietly. She'd try something again, something sneakier. But this time, I was ready. I had cameras, legal protection, and half the neighborhood watching her every move. The next battle was coming. I could feel it in my gut. And I wasn't just ready. I was looking forward to it. The cease and desist letter made its rounds faster than wildfire in dry brush. People whispered about it at the market, on walking trails, and even in the church parking lot. It wasn't every day that someone took legal action against the HOA president, especially someone like Karen who had bullied, manipulated, and smirked her way through years of unchecked power. But this wasn't just another scuffle over lawn height or mailbox paint. This was personal, and the entire neighborhood knew it. For a few days, things went surprisingly quiet. Karen stayed off public paths, didn't make appearances at the dog park, and let her daily patrols vanish like they'd never existed. Everyone could sense the storm brewing in her silence. But silence was never Karen's style. Just as people began to hope she'd learned her lesson, she returned in full force with a new plan. I found out when a utility truck pulled into my driveway early one morning, followed by a shiny black SUV. A man in a reflective vest stepped out with a clipboard, and Karen popped out from the SUV like it was her own personal limo. She approached my front porch with all the smugness of someone who thought she'd outmaneuvered the world. "Good morning, Hank," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "This gentleman is here to conduct a county inspection. We've received a report that your dock may be in violation of local environmental codes." I blinked, stunned for only a moment. "A report from who?" She smiled with her teeth but not her eyes. "The HOA received an anonymous tip, and out of concern for the community and the lake, we felt it was only right to escalate the matter. Just being proactive," she added, gesturing to the clipboard as if she hadn't orchestrated the whole thing herself. The inspector looked vaguely uncomfortable. He introduced himself as Alan and began asking about dock permits, repair history, and environmental impact. I answered every question calmly and factually, walking him through the dock's modifications, showing him the paperwork, and pulling out receipts for every repair. Karen hovered nearby the whole time like a crow watching a picnic. She kept waiting for something to go wrong, for some hole in my documentation she could pounce on. But there wasn't one. After nearly an hour, Alan gave me a firm nod. "Everything checks out," he said. "You're compliant with all structural and environmental regulations." He handed me a signed clearance form and walked back to his truck. Karen's face tightened like she'd just swallowed vinegar. She tried to hide it with another fake smile. "Well, I suppose that settles that," she said. I smiled back. "Sure does. And next time you send someone to harass me, maybe make sure the paperwork's not airtight." That wasn't the only surprise that week. A few days later, someone leaked a series of emails to several HOA members. It was never officially revealed who did it, but I had my guesses. The emails were between Karen and a handful of HOA board allies, discussing the wedding in advance. One thread included Karen giving instructions to quietly prep the dock the morning of the event, and another revealed her asking someone to help disable my security system using a borrowed Wi-Fi jammer. She even joked about it, calling it fishing in a dry pond. The evidence was damning. When word spread, residents were outraged. Not only had she lied about the wedding being spontaneous, but she'd attempted to tamper with private property and cover her tracks. The next HOA board meeting was chaos. People showed up in numbers that far exceeded the rec center's usual capacity. Karen tried to control the conversation, but her voice was drowned by waves of criticism. Paul stood up again, this time with the leaked emails printed and highlighted in bold. He read them aloud while Karen sat stone-faced in the chair beside him. After a lengthy and heated discussion, the board officially voted her out as HOA president. 3 votes for removal, 2 abstained. Karen stood up slowly, gathered her things, and walked out without saying a word. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. People waved more. Kids rode bikes on streets they used to avoid. I even had someone drop off a fresh pie with a note that read, "Thank you for putting her in her place." But Karen wasn't done yet. She didn't show her face for nearly a week, and just when we thought she might actually move out, a "for sale" sign appeared in her yard. It was like a beacon of relief. Rumors swirled about why she was leaving. Some said she'd been humiliated beyond repair. Others guessed legal pressure was mounting. But I knew the real reason. She'd lost control, and without control, Karen was nothing. She wasn't staying somewhere she could no longer dictate the rules. The best part came the day after the sign went up. I received a call from the Department of Environmental Protection. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about the dock setup damaging lakebed vegetation and introducing pollutants. The DEP sent a team to investigate. They arrived, reviewed everything, and determined the real damage had been done by the wedding setup, the same event Karen orchestrated. I didn't have to lift a finger. The department documented it all, including crushed reeds and traces of spilled gasoline from one of the improperly secured generators. A fine was issued, not to me, to Karen. Her name was on the permit application for the event. The total was over $6,000. That was the final blow. Karen quietly packed up her belongings and left before the weekend. No goodbye party, no farewell note. just a moving truck, a frown, and her tail between her legs. The house was bought 2 weeks later by a quiet, retired couple who liked gardening and bird watching. They stopped by one afternoon to ask about the local woodpecker population and whether it was okay to plant native bushes near the shoreline. I told them they were already my favorite neighbors. With Karen gone, I decided it was time for an upgrade. I rebuilt the dock, longer, wider, and reinforced with floating pontoons. A group of neighbors even helped with the project, laughing as they remembered the day the dock drifted. One of them painted a sign that now hangs proudly at the end. It reads, "Private Dock. Trespassers will be drifted." That evening, I sat in my rocking chair again, coffee in hand, watching the lake settle into a soft silver shimmer under the moonlight. The birds were singing, the frogs were croaking, and for the first time in months, there was no trace of Karen's high heels, her clipboard, or her megaphone. It was peaceful, it was quiet, and it was mine. The sun came up slow and gold across the lake that morning, catching the dew on the grass like a field full of diamonds. For the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up wondering what new surprise Karen had cooked up, or whether some stranger would be parked on my property, pretending not to know better. The house was quiet, the air still, and my coffee brewed without interruption. It felt like peace had finally arrived and decided to stay for a while, the kind of peace you don't notice when you have it but miss terribly when it's gone. Word had spread fast that Karen had officially moved out. Her house was empty, the windows dark, and the only signs of life were the cleaning crew cars parked out front. A few neighbors threw around theories about where she went. One said she was spotted in the next town over, trying to bully her way into another HOA. Someone else joked that she'd gone into hiding after the memes about her floating wedding hit 1 million views. I didn't care where she ended up. I just cared that she wasn't here anymore. The new owners moved in quietly 2 weeks later, a retired couple from out of state. Their names were Bill and Marlene, both soft-spoken and kind. Bill liked fishing, and Marlene liked to sit on their porch in the early evening with a mystery novel and a cup of mint tea. They brought over a basket of vegetables from their garden one day and thanked me for being the only neighbor who came to introduce himself. I didn't have the heart to tell them the rest of the neighborhood was still in shock from the Karen era. They'd come around in time. The neighborhood changed after she left. It wasn't just the absence of her voice or her clipboard. It was like the place had shed its skin. People who used to stay inside started showing up at community events again. The new HOA board, led by Paul, actually listened when residents voiced concerns. Nobody was fined for leaving their trash cans out 1 hour too long. Nobody got passive-aggressive letters taped to their doors about decorative gnomes. Even the teenagers on the corner stopped whispering every time they passed my property like I was some grumpy old man. One of them actually asked if I'd teach him how to build a birdhouse. A few weeks later, the Lake Committee decided to throw a celebration. Not an official HOA event, but something for the neighbors. They called it the Freedom Float, a floating celebration to mark the end of what everyone was politely calling the drama. Invitations were handmade and slipped into mailboxes. There'd be food, music, and floating lanterns at sundown. Paul stopped by personally to invite me and asked if we could use the newly rebuilt dock for launching the lanterns. I thought about it for half a second and nodded. As long as nobody tries to get married on it again? The day of the Freedom Float felt like something out of a dream. The weather was perfect, the sky that soft, pale blue that always seems impossible to describe. Boats gathered near the shoreline, people laughing, passing around coolers, dogs barking in excitement. Kids wore matching t-shirts someone had made with a cartoon version of Karen screaming as a dock drifted into the water. It was probably inappropriate, but it was also hilarious. Everyone seemed lighter, like they'd been holding their breath for too long and finally remembered how to breathe. Just before sunset, Paul stood on the dock and gave a short speech. He thanked everyone for coming, for staying strong through a strange time, and most of all, for sticking together. Then he turned to me and said, "And we want to thank Hank for showing us that sometimes the quietest neighbor knows exactly what to do when things go off the rails." The crowd cheered, and someone handed me a golden oar. Not real gold, of course, just spray-painted, but it said Best Dock Defense in bold letters. I held it up, and the laughter nearly knocked the dock over. As the sun dipped low, everyone lit their lanterns and set them on the water. Dozens of soft, glowing lights floated across the lake, each one swaying gently with the current. I sat back in my chair, the oar resting beside me, and watched the reflections dance. For a moment, I thought about Karen wherever she was, probably ranting about property lines to someone who had no idea what they'd gotten themselves into. I hoped for their sake they had a stronger dock. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best way. The kind of quiet where birds return, where you hear your own footsteps again, where you don't check your security cameras every morning just to see who trespassed overnight. I rebuilt my porch swing, fixed up the garden bed Karen once criticized as unsightly, and even painted the shed. No one complained, no one threatened fines. Instead, people waved from the street. Some even stopped by to compliment the dock upgrades or drop off extra tomatoes from their harvest. One morning, I stood at the edge of the dock with my coffee in hand, watching a blue heron stalk fish near the reeds. The dock had never looked better. Reinforced supports, fresh boards, even solar lights lining the edge. The old sign hung proudly at the entrance, the one the neighbors helped me paint. It read, "Private Dock. No exceptions." The heron took flight, slow and steady across the lake. The breeze rolled in, soft and cool, and I smiled. Just as I was about to head back up to the house, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the neighborhood group chat popped up on the screen. It was from Paul. His message read, "Hank, do you know anything about someone trying to build a zip line from the hill to your roof?" I stared at the screen for a moment, confused, then turned slowly to look up the slope behind my house. I squinted, and sure enough, there was a new rope line tied between two trees, leading straight toward my shed roof. I stared at it for a long time before muttering under my breath, "Not again." I turned around and walked toward my tool shed, already planning how to reinforce the roof and maybe set up a water-triggered air horn system. One thing was clear: the lake might be peaceful, but the neighborhood would never stay quiet for long.